And this is the formulation that I introduced. The first level of self-esteem was a dependent self, because what I felt was that self-esteem as a construct was not enough. The contradictions there were plenty. The paradox there was not explained by the notion of self-esteem. So I divided self-esteem into three parts based on the work of Lovinger. She did her work back in the 60s, based on the work of Maslow, based on the work of Carl Rogers and Nathaniel Branden, who had talked about these things. But again, we're not in the majority. Most people who talked about self-esteem talked about it as a single construct. The second component, self-esteem that is not contingent on others. And finally, the third component essentially does not even need to be called self-esteem, simply a sense of self. Let me begin with each one, describing each one. And what I'll do in describing each one is talk about the two components of self-esteem. So essentially what I'll create is a 3x2. The three types of self-esteem, each one how it relates to worthiness, to self-respect, and how it relates to competence, the two components of Nathaniel Branden's work. So first of all, in terms of worthiness. In terms of worthiness, a person who has high dependent self-esteem is other-determined. They enjoy and they need the appraisal. If I do well in a lecture and I get external feedback, that makes me feel great. If I don't get great feedback, I feel awful. If I do well on an exam and I get good feedback from my TF or parents, I feel terrific. If someone tells me that they don't like something that I said, I feel awful. My life is constantly affected by what other people think or say, or what I think that they think, or what I think that they mean. Constant evaluation. What do other people think of me? Like a looking glass, looking at other people as it reflects on me, and taking their evaluation as the sense of self that I have. People who have high dependent self-esteem are primarily, not only, but primarily motivated by what other people think and say. I will choose a job that will yield the most prestige, the highest social status, that will yield the most accolades and praise. I will choose a partner where I think most other people will approve of and like. Again, the sense of self contingent on other people. The important decisions are made based on other people's approval or disapproval. Second, sense of competence. The second component of self-esteem, according to Branden, comes through other comparison. How am I doing relative to other people? If I do better than others on a test, I feel great. If others do better than I do, no matter how objectively good or bad it is, what matters is how I'm doing relative to others. William James captured this. He said, I, who have staked my all in psychology, am mortified when others know more psychology than I, compared to other people. In fact, most psychologists have talked about self-esteem as dependent self-esteem. The work of Cooley, talking about the looking glass metaphor. The work of Mead back in 1934, talking about dependent self-esteem. How we evaluate ourselves depends on what others say or think, or what we perceive they think or say about us. Most of the thinkers have talked about it. This is best captured, and this is where I thought about it for the first time in fairy tales. This is best captured by the evil queen. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And as long as the mirror says, you, my queen, are the fairest of them all, she feels great. As soon as there is one person who is more fair than thee, immediately she's mortified. The two components of self-esteem here. First of all, other-determined. I'm asking a mirror to evaluate me, not self-determined. So my worthiness comes from an external source. And second, competence. I compare myself to others. Is there anyone who is fairer than I? Dependent self-esteem. Now, I've quite literally now caricatured dependent self-esteem. So let me make it this very clear. Everyone has some dependent self-esteem. There is no person that I've met or have heard of who is oblivious to what other people think or say, or to social comparisons. It's part of human nature. Nature to be commanded must be obeyed. If we fight it, it will only intensify, as we've seen numerous examples throughout the semester. Permission to be human, and part of being human is that we all have some dependent self-esteem. The question is of degree. The important thing to understand about this model, the 3 levels, is that it's an epigenetic model. It is an epigenetic model. And I've no idea what that means. No. Epigenetic is that you first need to get past the first stage in order to get to the second stage. You first need to get past the second stage in order to get to the third stage. That you cannot skip, for example, from stage 1 to stage 3 without going through 2. So everyone experiences dependent self-esteem, always. However, after a time, if we have healthy dependence, which is natural, which we all have at an earlier age, later on it becomes independent. And if we're able to cultivate healthy independent self-esteem, we go up to the unconditional self-esteem, to the state of interdependence, which is the highest level. But even at that highest level, we still have remnants, and we'll always have elements of the dependent as well as the independent sense of self. When I started doing my research, initially, I depicted independent versus dependent, I hadn't thought of unconditional at the time, as independent good, dependent bad. And I tried to get rid of the dependent self. And what happened, it just simply intensified. It simply got stronger. And I became even more dependent. Whereas as soon as I started to accept it, remember, I talked about it, permission to be human. As soon as I accepted it as part of human nature, it actually lost much of its power over me. Still there, as it is for everyone. But the question is of a degree. The second level, self-esteem, independent self-esteem. As its name suggests, that's self-esteem that's not contingent on other people. So in terms of worthiness, I evaluate myself according to my own standards. I'm self-determined. I determine how good a book that I wrote is. Ultimately, the ultimate arbiter. I do take into consideration and listen to what other people are saying, but at the end of the day, I'm the one who decides. Competence, not comparison to others, but comparison to oneself. Have I improved? Am I a better writer today than I was in the past? Do I know more math today than I knew at the beginning of the semester? Am I able to apply more things from positive psychology than I applied initially? Not compared to my roommate who's applying so much more or so much less, but mostly focused on the self. Once again, people who wrote about this type of self-esteem, Nathaniel Branden, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and a handful of others. A person who has dependent self-esteem looks for constant approval, is afraid of criticism. Very often it's associated with perfectionism. Whereas a person who has an independent sense of self looks for criticism. In fact, that person constantly looks for beautiful enemies. People who will challenge him or her, who will help them in their apprenticeship to the truth. Because they want to improve. Their motivation, their primary motivation is, what am I passionate about? What do I care about? What do I really, really want to do with my life? They're about pursuing self-concordant goals. A friend of mine, Mike Moldavano, philosopher, writes about dependent self-esteem. And he says that this person answers or is associated with the following. We say that we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. We say that we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. Many people with dependent self-esteem say, yes, I'm really pursuing what is right, what is true, what is noble. Whereas actually the motivation is protecting the self from criticism, from negative evaluation, from a lower sense of self-esteem that is contingent on others. And once again, in contrast to saying we want the truth, meaning we want to be correct, we have the person with independent self-esteem who wants beautiful enemies, who really is an apprentice to the truth. To summarize, initially the first 2 by 2, dependent self-esteem, worthiness determined by others. I do things for accolades, for praise primarily. And competence, how well am I doing relative to other people? Am I better or worse than them? And that determines my self-esteem. In terms of my worthiness, in terms of independent self-esteem, I compare myself to myself. Have I improved? Am I getting better? Am I learning? And my worthiness is determined by my own evaluation. Third level, unconditional self-esteem. In many ways, this is not even self-esteem because there is no esteeming involved here. The first component, worthiness, not contingent. It's not contingent on other people's evaluations. It's not even contingent on my evaluation. I'm confident enough not to be engaged in evaluations. In terms of competence, it's interdependent. I don't compare myself to how well I'm doing relative to others, nor even to how well I'm doing relative to myself. I'm in a state of being, interdependence with others, fully comfortable in my own skin. For example, a person writing a book who has high dependent self-esteem is primarily motivated by the accolades, by the praise that he or she will get. A person who has high dependent and also by how well that book is doing relative to other books. A person with independent self-esteem writes a book and derives pleasure and satisfaction from writing better than he or she did in the past, from improving, as well as from self-evaluation of the book. This is good. A person who has unconditional self-esteem simply writes a book. Why? Because he or she wants, if they have a good idea, a good book to be out there. They derive as much satisfaction, as much pleasure when they see another person's book who is good. They're interdependent. They see themselves as one with others. Once again, everyone has some components of dependence, some components of independence, and some component of unconditional self-esteem. The question is of degree. The model is epigenetic. It takes a lifetime very often to cultivate more and more of the unconditional self. Now, one of the criticisms that I face and other writers who have written about unconditional self-esteem is that to be at this stage of where I don't really care or don't care that much about whether I get criticism or evaluation is that one becomes detached from others, that one does not care. But that is not the case. You see, there are many parallels between unconditional self-esteem and the Buddhist conception of detachment. Let me read to you something that was written by the Buddhist nun Thupten Chodron, and I quote, "Ordinarily, we become very upset when we are criticized or insulted. We're angry when our possessions are stolen. We're jealous if someone else gets the promotion we wanted. We're proud of our looks or our athletic ability. By contrast, when we reach the state of detachment, our mind becomes clearer and more capable of enjoying things for what they are. We live more in the present, appreciating things as they are now, without fantasies about what they are or will be. We become less ego-sensitive to every action other people do in relation to us." Now, at the same time, detachment or unconditional self-esteem, which is the parallel that I'm drawing, does not mean being indifferent or rejecting other people's feelings. She continues, "On the contrary, when we're not attached, our relationships with others are harmonious, and in fact, we care more about them. We become more compassionate, more empathic toward others. Detachment or unconditional self-esteem simply means that we are distancing ourselves or not experiencing as much feelings of jealousy, feelings of envy, constant superiority or inferiority, ongoing comparison to others. It means on many levels that we are one with them. This is what the research shows. You know, in fact, you can think about unconditional self-esteem as parallel to going to a movie. When you go to a movie, what happens? You're empathizing with the characters there. When they go through a hard time, you experience a hard time viscerally. When they thrive and succeed, you thrive and succeed. You're one with them. Why? Because your ego is not threatened. You're not threatened by their success. Their good looks are not threatening to you. Their successes are not a threat to you. Why? Because it's just a movie. Now imagine if we could have these emotions, feeling with as opposed to against. Imagine if we can have these emotions in real life. How much more powerful would they be? This is the experience, again, of a movie, but so much more powerful because it's real, of a person who has high levels of unconditional self-esteem. Cultivating self-esteem, unconditional self-esteem, takes time. It's a lifelong process. In many ways, it's parallel to learning how to walk. What happens when we learn how to walk? Initially, we can't. After a while, we're able to get up, but we need some help. We're dependent on a chair, on our parents to hold us, dependent on other people. Next level, after a while, is independent. We're able to walk by ourselves. But we walk still by thinking about picking up this foot, and we're precarious, we're uncertain, but we're independent. Later on, we simply and naturally walk. We don't need to think about it constantly. When it comes to a sense of self, initially there is no sense of self when we're born. After a while, the sense of self is dependent on other people, other people's evaluation. Then, after a while, we become independent of what other people say, or we try to assert our independence, but we're constantly evaluating ourselves, constantly comparing ourselves. And then finally, after a while, when we cultivate this strong sense of independence, we simply and naturally exist. That is, if nature is allowed to take its course, and that takes time. David Schnark talks about the average person at the age of 50 becoming known rather than validated, strong unconditional self-esteem. Maslow talks about the self-actualized person at the age of 45 or 50. That's unconditional self-esteem. It takes time. It's epigenetic. But the process itself, as we improve and grow, is or can be as enjoyable, as pleasurable as learning how to walk. I'll see you next week. So we had a breakfast this morning with the teaching staff of this class. It was our final breakfast get-together, and I'm a little bit sad. So hopefully I'll be happier by the end of the class. Today we'll finish up on self-esteem, and the next time is the last time we meet, for this semester at least, and I'll summarize what we have done, where we have been, and all the places that we will go. Just a recap on what we did, which is on the slide now. There's been a lot of research, a lot of talk of how important self-esteem is. And it is important. There's research suggesting that it's connected to our well-being, to our success, that it's inversely related to crime, substance abuse, unhappiness, anxiety, depression. So self-esteem is important, we know that. However, not all was well in self-esteem land, as we discussed last time. Part of the problem is that there are contradictory evidence. On the one hand, self-esteem is associated with benevolence and generosity and empathy. On the other hand, high self-esteem has been shown to be associated with hostility, lack of cooperation, defensiveness. There's also misunderstandings about how self-esteem affects performance, how it affects happiness, and where that comes from, the paradox of self-esteem. Sometimes we feel like we're doing so well, we're getting so many accolades, our self-esteem increases, only to go back to its base level, only worse, because now we have to do even more to come back to our base level of self-esteem. Have to get more accolades, more achievements. Nothing is enough anymore. So there are these contradictory evidence of where self-esteem comes from and its consequences. And one of the ways to explain it is by drawing on the work of people like Maslow, people like Nathaniel Branden, people like Carl Rogers, Rollo May, Lovinger, to see how we can perhaps break down self-esteem into its components. And that's what my dissertation did. And this is what I presented to you in the previous class. Basically take the ideas of these select few researchers who had been thinking about it, people like Bob Keegan across the road from the Ed School, thinking about self-esteem more developmentally. And I presented the epigenetic model. Epigenetic, once again, meaning that one level has to be fulfilled, or at least partly fulfilled, before we can go to the next level. And the three levels are dependent self-esteem, independent self-esteem, and unconditional self-esteem. Dependent self-esteem, the two components of it, first of all, a person with high dependence needs the accolades of others constantly, chooses whether it's a career path or what to do this afternoon based on how much approval that will gain him or her. Person with dependent self-esteem, when it comes to competence, always compares him or herself to others. Am I better or am I worse? Superior or inferior? Independent self-esteem is self-esteem that's contingent on the self. In terms of how I evaluate myself, it's my internal voice that's speaking. In terms of how my levels of competence are determined, it depends on how much I have improved, how much better I've got, how much I feel that I have fulfilled my potential. That's independent self-esteem, not contingent on what other people say or think. Unconditional self-esteem is the highest level. The level that Maslow would talk about is self-actualization. What David Schnarch talks about as differentiated, or at the level of being known, rather than desiring to be validated. Unconditional self-esteem is when our self-esteem is high enough, we feel good enough about ourselves not to be concerned with evaluation of others or even with self-evaluations. In terms of comparison, we don't compare. We're interdependent, connected to others. So the example that I gave last time is of a book. Let's say I publish a book and I have high dependent self-esteem. First of all, I write it, I publish it so that I can get accolades. My primary motivation is external approval. My primary motivation is wanting to bring out a book that will be better than the other books out there. So relative competence as well as externally other determined. If I bring a book or write a book and I have high independent self-esteem, I write it and I evaluate it myself. This is good work, or this is not so good, needs improvement. In terms of comparison, I compare it to myself. I've improved a lot since I started writing. This book is actually better than my previous book. My work is becoming more authentic, more real. That's independent self-esteem evaluation. Unconditional self-esteem, the highest level that we know of. I write a book, and I'm not concerned about evaluation of whether it's good or bad. Of course, I want it to be better and better, but that doesn't affect how I feel about myself. I simply exist. I write the book. I'm in a state of flow, experiencing the experience. In terms of whether it's better than others or better than I've written, it doesn't matter. What I'm happy about, what makes me happy, is bringing a good book into existence. And I would be as happy if someone else wrote the book. I'd be as happy or happier if someone else wrote a better book that can help others more. The important thing to understand about this model, the three levels, is that we all have all three basically from a very young age. It's not that the Dalai Lama or Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela or Margaret Mead, the people whom we know are self-actualized. It's not that they don't care about what other people say. However, they're most of their lives, most of the time, self-determined. Do what they believe in. Feel a sense of connection to others. Want to make the world a better place. But it's not that they don't care. It's not that they don't evaluate themselves relative to themselves or relative to others. That's part of human nature. My error when I started with this research was that I said to myself, okay, I just want to have independent. And later when I understood what unconditional self-esteem was, I said, I want to have unconditional self-esteem. And I situated those two on the good side, and dependent self-esteem, bad. And what then happened, it only intensified my dependency on others. Because when we fight nature, nature fights back, and we can't win. You know, it's like going back to the second class. If I say to myself, Tal, don't be nervous, don't be nervous, don't be anxious, what happens? The pink elephants begin to come out. And I become even more anxious and more nervous. Whereas where I accept it as part of my nature, let it be, permission to be human, it loses a lot of its vitality and force and control. Because then I can say, okay, yes, I care that this person didn't like my book, didn't like my class, and I accept it, it's natural, it hurts me, I would much rather that they all like it. But then I can move on and say, okay, what would be the most authentic life that I can lead? How can I be the teacher who is known as opposed to constantly concerned about validation? Active acceptance revisited. Accepting my nature and then deciding what would be the most appropriate action to take. One of my role models is Warren Bennis. Warren Bennis has done a lot of research and a lot of speaking and a lot of work in the area of leadership. He teaches out at University of Southern California, was before that at Harvard, at MIT, and he came to Harvard Business School for 3 years. And the first year as a visiting professor, the first year I took his class, which was an extraordinary experience. The second year, when he taught it, I was his teaching assistant. And I used to work a lot with him and interact with him, and was constantly amazed by Warren. Warren at the time was 80 years old, now he's 83. Would walk into the room and the room would light up. It was his smile, his posture, his openness, his expressiveness was there about, he was interacting with people and making the other person, just by being there, feel better about themselves. And yet he was confident and strong, and what I would classify as self-actualized, as a person with very high unconditional self-esteem. And we became very close, and he helped me in many areas, most of all by just being himself. me observing him, learning from him, assimilating what he had to give the world and what he was giving day in and day out to thousands and millions of people who have read his books, who have been to his lectures, who have had the privilege of interacting with him. And one day, after a couple of years that I was his TA and we were close, I said to him, "Warren, how is it that you're like this? How is it that you're like this?" And his response was, put his hand on my shoulder, looked at me with his calm, accepting, giving smile, and said, "Tal, I wasn't always like this." And that's where he left it. And this is what I needed to hear. Because in his response were two very important, many more, but two very important messages. The first message is that it evolves. It takes time. You don't become third-level, self-actualized individual overnight at the age of 20 or even at the age of 40. It takes time, it takes work, it takes self-awareness. It takes falling down and getting up, learning to fail, and then learning from that failure. It takes learning to accept oneself. It takes being open and being vulnerable and making mistakes. It takes being human, fully human. I was not always like this. The second message that I got from this is that Warren was genuine. He was real. He didn't say to me, "Oh, Tal, stop." "Oh, not really. Come on. Thank you." But no. He was real. He knows his worth. He's confident. There was no false modesty involved, and it reminded me that when I started thinking about self-esteem and the true meaning of self-esteem, as you read in Brandon's work. By the way, he and Nathaniel Brandon are good friends. When I started reading Brandon and I realized what real self-esteem was about, I realized that people with high levels of self-esteem are modest. They don't have the need to show off. Arrogance, narcissism is the exact opposite of self-esteem. Hubris, foolish pride is the exact opposite of what a true sense of self is. So when I understood that, one of my most important goals was to become, more importantly, to be modest. And it was incredibly important for me that everyone knows how modest I was. Francis Bacon, the British philosopher, said that modesty is but another form of ostentation. And for me, that certainly was the case. It's not always the case. I think Warren Bennett is modest and truly modest. I think Nelson Mandela, when he's being modest, he really is modest. But the question is, how do you get to that level of modesty? And you get to this level of modesty by being authentic, by being real, by going through the process. And the process, in many ways, as I've described last time, is like learning how to walk. Initially, when we're born, we have no idea what walking even is. Then, later on, we're able to get up, but we need the support either of another person or something to lean on. And we take our first precarious steps around the desk, for example. And then after a while, we can walk without help, but we're still thinking about every step. And we fall down and we get up again, learn to fail or fail to learn. And then we continue walking. We're very conscious of how we pick up this leg. And when you watch a baby learn how to walk, it's fascinating. So many things have to come together for this simple, seemingly simple action. And then after a while, the baby becomes more confident and she begins to run. And she no longer has to think about walking or running, because then she naturally She simply walks. Same with a sense of self. Initially, we have no sense of self. There's no differentiation between the me and the mom or other objects in the world. Gradually, we develop a sense of self, but that sense of self is completely dependent. Physically as well as psychologically, we're dependent on our parents, significant adults, older sibling. And then after a while, that usually happens when we're teenagers, we begin to assert our independence. That's when we begin to want to hear our own voice, want to make our own voice heard. That's the difficult teenage years. Difficult for the teenager, difficult for the parent. But it's natural. It's part of evolution. And we need our boundaries at that time, and at the same time we need to sometimes break boundaries. We need to test reality, assert ourselves. And then over time, when we do that, over time, we begin a new process simultaneously. And that is the process of real differentiation, where the independent self becomes so strong that we're able to connect to others as well. Once again, going back to relationship, Nathaniel Branden, the more independent we become, the more interdependent we can be. And then we evolve, and that takes a long time. And if we have missed out on the dependent side, for example, if we didn't get any accolades and any praise and unconditional self-regard, in the words of Carl Rogers, when we were younger, then we have that need. Remember, the model is epigenetic. We can't jump over a stage. And then very often it would take a therapist to provide us with unconditional self-regard so that we can go to the next level. Or we need a relationship or relationships where we cultivate unconditional self-regard so that we can go to the next stage. And if we were, when we were teenagers, constantly told to be quiet, to behave, prevented from asserting ourselves, being ourselves, then we're unlikely to get to the next level in a smooth way. And then very often later on in life, we need to do that first, to assert ourselves, like teenagers did or do, so that we can make it to the next level. But regardless, this is not a smooth transition. Why? Because there are no perfect parents. Because there is no perfect environment. There are no perfect teachers. And for us to evolve naturally and smoothly through these stages, it's just unrealistic. It doesn't exist, not here on Earth. But then when we evolve over time, through the hardships, through the difficulties, making mistakes, falling, getting up again, gradually the interdependent self, the unconditional self-esteem emerges, and we feel much more comfortable in our skin. Maslow said that he didn't find people below the age of 45 who were self-actualized. And even though self-actualized people still have remnants of independent as well as dependent self-esteem, it never really goes away. But it's only weaker now. It's not dominant. It's not what they are about. The next accolade, the next praise. Being devastated when someone doesn't like them. Being devastated when they're not the best. They accept it. They say, oh, it would have been nice to win this. And then they move on and they ask, how can I make the world a better place? How can I be a conduit for positive emotions? Maslow didn't find anyone below the age of 45. Schnarch talks about how it's in the 50s and 60s that the individuals become differentiated, and that's where the highest potential for passion is within a relationship. It takes time. I was not always this way. It was not always like this, as Ben has pointed out. Very important lesson. Many people ask about the universal nature of this theory. Because, independence is very much or individualism is very much a Western construct, or American, Western European construct. You go to Africa, very different. The concept of we, of a group, is much more central to who they are. You go to Asia, the concept of the we, collectivism, the group, is much more central to who they are. So what about other areas? Is this a Western-centric theory? And the answer is not necessarily. You see, if our goal is to become fully actualized, or to strive toward that, to be in the process of becoming a person, in the words of Rogers, then that final stage of interdependence is the same in all cultures. All cultures value it, and they value it just the same. The process may look different for a person in Japan than for a person in the United States, for a person in Israel or Egypt compared to a person living in Zimbabwe. The process may look different. However, it will have many similarities. Remember, I talked about the Dalai Lama in the third class or so, who said that one of the problems that he sees in Western psychology is that we focus too much on cultural differences. And again, Dalai Lama is extremely sensitive culturally. But he says there are differences, we need to study them. At the same time, we need to study even more so the similarities, that which brings us together, that unites us. And there are a lot of similarities. And hopefully soon there will be more and more research on this topic, applying it to different cultures and tweaking it and seeing how it relates outside the Western tradition. Because most of the research that I'll mention in a minute has been done in the United States, some of it in the UK. It'll be interesting to see what that process looks like elsewhere. But at its core, it is much more similar than different. Why is it important to be independent? Why is it that we should strive for this evolution? Shouldn't we stay at the conformity, dependent